Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going deep into the world of military psychiatry.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, we've got warppsychiatry.pdf to guide us. It looks pretty dense, but hey, that's what these deep dives are all about, right?
Absolutely. Unpacking the complex stuff.
Exactly. And today, we're going to try to understand how mental health has been seen and dealt with in war, kind of tracing the evolution of the thinking around it. I mean, think about it. From World War I all the way to Vietnam and beyond, how much has changed?
It's incredible, right? How much our understanding has evolved.
So true. Okay, so the document kicks off by saying that, okay, armies have always had their issues, right? Like alcoholism, disciplinary problems.
Right, those have always been there.
But it wasn't until the Russo-Japanese War, back in the early 1900s, that combat stress casualties, they became like a recognized medical thing.
A distinct concern, yeah.
Why was that war? Why was that the turning point?
Well, I think it was just the sheer brutality of it. I mean, both sides had massive casualties.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And it really forced military leaders, and of course the medical folks, to actually confront the psychological toll.
Like they couldn't ignore it anymore.
Exactly. They had to acknowledge it. And you know what's really interesting?
What's that?
It was the Russian physicians who were ahead of the curve here.
Really?
Yeah, they were the first to bring in actual psychiatric specialists
Wow.
to treat soldiers both right there on the front lines and back home.
So like pioneers in this whole field.
Absolutely.
That's fascinating. So did they have a term for what they were seeing? Like, did they name it?
Yeah, they started using this concept of war neurosis
Neurosis.
to try and capture, the whole spectrum of symptoms they were encountering.
Okay.
But, it's important to remember their understanding back then was still pretty basic.
Right. Things have come a long way since then.
Oh, definitely. They didn't have the same clear distinctions we have today between like psychotic and neurotic conditions.
Yeah, I can imagine that made things really difficult trying to treat something you don't fully grasp yet.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity.
Okay, so war neurosis, that's where it kind of started. But then how did this whole understanding of combat stress evolve from there?
Well, World War I, that was a huge GE turning point.
Of course, yeah.
The horrors of trench warfare, all that shelling, close quarters combat,
You read about it, it's just unimaginable.
It led to this unprecedented number of psychological casualties.
And that's when we start hearing the term shell shock, right?
Exactly.
Just captures the intensity of what they were going through.
Doesn't it? It became the catch-all phrase for this wide array of symptoms, from physical things like tremors, even paralysis, to psychological things like nightmares, memory loss.
Like the whole system is overwhelmed.
Exactly.
The document talks about how the U.S. Army, they actually learned from the British and French experiences.
Right, they saw what was happening.
And they started implementing their own system for managing these casualties. They actually renamed shell shock to war neuroses.
Trying to be more specific.
Yeah. And they emphasize these three core principles of treatment: proximity, immediacy, and expectancy.
The cornerstones, yeah.
Can you break those down for us?
Sure. So proximity basically means you're treating the soldier as close to their unit as possible.
So keeping them in their familiar environment.
Exactly. Minimizing that separation from their buddies, their routine.
Okay.
Immediacy is all about speed. You intervene quickly, you stop those stress reactions from taking root.
So before it becomes a bigger problem.
Precisely. And then expectancy. This one's really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's about reinforcing the idea that they're going to return to duty soon. You instill hope, you encourage that fighting spirit.
So like a psychological boost.
It is. It gives them something to strive for.
I like it. I mean, they all seem pretty intuitive, right? Like, yeah, of course, that makes sense. But can you delve a bit deeper into the why behind their effectiveness? I think our listeners would love to hear more about that.
Absolutely. So let's take proximity. Remember, a soldier experiencing shell shock, they're already dealing with so much trauma.
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom.
So keeping them close to their unit, it's like a safety net, right?
Yeah.
It reinforces the idea that they're not alone, not abandoned.
So it's about connection.
Totally. It helps combat that sense of isolation that can make things so much worse.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, what about immediacy? How does that actually help?
Well, think of it like a physical wound. The longer you wait to treat it, the worse the infection can get, right?
Yep. Yeah, makes sense.
Same idea here. Quick intervention prevents those stress reactions from becoming deeply ingrained, much harder to treat later on.
So it's like damage control.
Exactly. Now, expectancy, this one might seem a bit counterintuitive at first.
Okay, yeah, I'm curious.
But imagine you're a soldier who's been through hell. You feel broken, lost, maybe even worthless.
It's like their whole world has been shattered.
Exactly. But then your doctors, your commanders, they tell you, hey, we expect you to recover. We need you back out there.
It's a vote of confidence.
It is. And that can be incredibly powerful. It taps into their inner strength, helps them overcome the challenges they're facing.
I get it's like a mental reset button almost.
In a way, yeah. And these three principles, they work together. They create a framework for recovery. It's about restoring their sense of belonging, their agency, their hope.
Wow, that's really insightful. So, we've seen how combat stress became recognized, how treatment approaches evolved. But what about the nature of the combat itself? I mean, does the intensity of the fighting affect the types of psychiatric casualties we see?
That's a great question. And yeah, the document actually points out a really clear distinction between high-intensity warfare and low-intensity warfare.
Okay, so tell us more about that.
So in high-intensity combat, where there's that constant threat of death, relentless violence, you tend to see more acute reactions.
Like what?
Think battle fatigue, conversion disorders, severe anxiety.
Makes sense. It's like your system is in overdrive.
Exactly. But then you've got low-intensity warfare, where the fighting might be more sporadic, but the stress is chronic.
It's like a constant low hum.
Yeah, and in those settings, you see more of what are called disorders of loneliness.
Disorders of loneliness. That's interesting. What does that actually mean for the soldiers?
Well, picture this. You're a soldier, stationed in a remote outpost, far from home, from anyone you love.
Okay, I'm with you.
Boredom sets in, uncertainty, that constant low-level fear, always waiting for the next attack.
It's like a different kind of pressure cooker.
Exactly. And that prolonged exposure to isolation, to that kind of stress, it takes its toll.
So we're talking about depression, maybe substance abuse.
You got it. And even disciplinary problems can arise.
Wow. So it's like the absence of constant fighting that creates a different kind of strain.
Right. It's not just about the battles, it's about the whole context of the deployment.
You know, the document, it's full of these fascinating case studies.
Yeah, some really compelling ones.
Are there any that come to mind that really highlight these different ways combat can impact mental health?
Absolutely. There's one from the Vietnam War that always gets to me. It's about this corporal, let's call him Corporal A. He volunteered to be a tunnel rat.
Oh, wow. Tunnel rat.
Can you imagine the pressure of that job?
I can't even begin to.
He had this horrific near-death experience in a tunnel, came face-to-face with a Viet Cong soldier.
Oh my God.
It triggered a catatonic state in him, just shut down completely.
It's like the mind just couldn't handle it anymore.
Right. A classic example of acute stress reaction in high-intensity combat.
It really underscores the profound impact these experiences can have.
Doesn't it? And the importance of having mental health professionals right there in the combat zones ready to help.
Absolutely. Now, what about an example of like the low-intensity warfare leading to issues?
Oh, there's a case from World War II that's quite illustrative. It's about this infantry staff sergeant who was near a shell explosion. And after that, he started experiencing paralysis, stammering, and he seemed to have memory loss.
Wow, that's a lot to deal with.
It was. At the time, they labeled it as a conversion reaction.
Conversion reaction? What does that even mean?
It's basically the mind's way of coping with overwhelming trauma. It converts psychological distress into physical symptoms.
So the body is expressing what the mind can't.
Exactly. Like the body becomes a battleground for the psychological trauma.
Wow, that's powerful.
It is. You know, the staff sergeant was eventually diagnosed with what we now know as PTSD.
Okay.
But back then, the understanding was so different. It's heartbreaking to think that some soldiers were labeled as malingerers or fakers because their symptoms didn't fit the medical knowledge of the time.
It really shows how far we've come in recognizing the complexity of all this.
It does, and the need for compassionate, accurate diagnoses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of PTSD, this brings us to a huge E concept in military psychiatry.
Right, a core concept.
And what's interesting is the document traces this idea all the way back to the 19th century.
Really?
Yeah, to this idea of traumatic neurosis linked to railway accidents.
Railway accidents, that's an interesting connection.
I know, right? But when you think about it, those were incredibly traumatic events back then.
Oh, I imagine, yeah.
The carnage, the suddenness of it all, the terror. Doctors started noticing that survivors, they were exhibiting these psychological symptoms that look a lot like what we associate with PTSD now. Anxiety, flashbacks, nightmares, the whole gamut.
So even though they didn't have the term PTSD yet, they were already seeing the effects of trauma.
Exactly. It was this crucial early recognition that trauma, even outside of war, could have these lasting psychological consequences.
It's like laying the groundwork for our modern understanding.
So fascinating how observations from civilian settings actually shape the field of military psychiatry.
Isn't it? And it highlights the fact that PTSD, it's not just a veteran's issue.
Right. Anyone who's been through trauma can experience it.
Exactly. So while we're focusing on the military today, these insights, they really have broader implications.
Absolutely. It's about understanding and addressing trauma in all its forms.
Well said.
Now, before we move on, is there anything else in this section that our listeners should keep in mind?
Yes, absolutely. There's another crucial aspect we need to talk about. Reintegration.
Reintegration. That's such a huge topic and so important for veterans and their families.
It really is. So imagine you're a soldier. You spent months, maybe years, in a combat zone.
Dealing with the unthinkable.
Exactly. And suddenly you're expected to transition back to civilian life.
Which must feel so foreign after what they've been through.
Right. Like stepping into a different world.
Totally.
And the document, it really highlights the challenges of this. Many veterans struggle to reconcile their wartime experiences with peacetime values.
Like trying to fit two different realities together.
It's tough. They may have trouble connecting with loved ones who haven't shared those experiences, and they're often facing the daunting task of finding a new purpose, a new identity outside the military structure.
That's a lot to process.
It is. And on top of all that, they might be dealing with the invisible wounds of war, the PTSD, the anxiety, the depression.
All those hidden battles.
The document really stresses that reintegration is a complex process.
It's not just flipping a switch.
No, it takes understanding, empathy, a real commitment to supporting these veterans.
It's about recognizing that their journey doesn't end when they come home.
Exactly.
Well said. We've covered so much already, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. This is a really rich and insightful conversation, and I can't wait to dig even deeper.
As we go through this, one thing that really jumps out is the Vietnam War. It was a turning point for military psychiatry.
Oh, definitely. It's like a whole chapter in itself.
Yeah.
The document really dives into the unique challenges of that conflict, how it forced a reassessment of, well, everything.
Yeah, how we understand and treat those psychological wounds of war. It's fascinating, but also really heavy stuff.
Absolutely. Vietnam was just so different from previous wars. The way it was fought, the political climate back home. How did all that impact the mental health of the soldiers who were there?
It's a complex picture, that's for sure. But one thing the document highlights is that prolonged exposure to guerrilla warfare.
Right, that constant uncertainty, the hidden enemy.
Exactly. It created this chronic stress that just wore down their defenses,
Like a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when or where the next attack might come from.
That's it. It was a war fought in the shadows, and that psychological toll was immense. And then, on top of that, you had the war's unpopularity back home. A lot of soldiers came back to a divided nation, facing judgment, even scorn.
Instead of the gratitude they deserved.
It was a double whammy, really. Fighting a war overseas and then coming home to another kind of battle. And we can't forget about the one-year rotation policy. You'd think that would help, right? Prevent burnout.
Yeah, you'd assume so.
But it actually had some unintended negative consequences.
Really? How so?
Well, remember how we talked about unit cohesion? How crucial it is.
Yeah, that sense of camaraderie.
The constant churn of soldiers rotating in and out, it made it really hard to build those bonds, that trust, that shared experience that's so vital for psychological well-being.
So it's like constantly having to start over, rebuild those relationships.
Exactly. And without that solid foundation, well, it's not surprising that we saw a rise in drug abuse among soldiers in Vietnam.
So it was a way to cope, to numb the pain.
It was a way to deal with the isolation, the stress, the disillusionment. The document doesn't shy away from that reality. It forces us to confront the fact that even well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences.
That's a really important point. It's a reminder that things are rarely straightforward, especially when we're dealing with the human mind in war.
Exactly. It's complex, it's layered, and Vietnam really highlights that.
This conversation about Vietnam, it underscores how much context matters. It's not just about the battles, it's about the whole picture, the social and political climate, the policies, everything.
Absolutely. You can't separate those things. To really understand the psychological wounds of war, you have to look beyond the battlefield itself. You have to consider the broader context.
That's so true. And speaking of looking beyond the battlefield, the document really emphasizes the importance of prevention and early intervention when it comes to mental health in the military.
Oh, absolutely. You can't just wait for things to fall apart and then try to pick up the pieces. You've got to be proactive.
Right, like creating a culture where seeking help is encouraged, not stigmatized.
Exactly. It needs to be seen as a sign of strength, not weakness. And we need to give our service members the tools they need to stay mentally healthy throughout their careers.
It sounds so simple, but I imagine there are still barriers, right? Like that stigma surrounding mental health, especially in a culture that values strength and resilience so highly.
You're right, there are. And it's a huge obstacle. We need to break down that stigma, make it clear that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to ask for help. In fact, it's crucial.
So it's a two-pronged approach. Change attitudes and improve access to care.
Exactly. It's got to be both. We need to encourage help-seeking behavior and make sure high-quality mental health care is readily available. And not just during deployments, but when they come home, too.
Right. It's got to be continuous support throughout their entire military journey.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another critical area, research and innovation.
Okay, tell me more about that.
We can't just stand still, right?
Right.
We've got to keep pushing forward. We need to develop more effective treatments for PTSD, depression, anxiety, all the issues that can stem from combat.
So it's about constantly searching for better ways to help those who are suffering.
Exactly. And it's not just about new treatments. It's about making sure those treatments are tailored to the individual. There's no one-size-fits-all solution here.
That's such a good point. Everyone's experience is unique. Now, the document also talks about reintegration. And I think that's something our listeners are really interested in. It's not enough to just thank veterans for their service and then send them on their way.
No, not at all. We need to do better than that.
So what does a more comprehensive approach to reintegration look like?
Well, for starters, it's about practical things. Helping veterans find meaningful work, connecting them with resources for any mental or physical health needs.
Okay, so providing concrete support.
Yeah, but it's also about something deeper. It's about providing opportunities for them to connect with other veterans, people who understand what they've been through. It's about creating a sense of community.
But that sense of belonging we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It's vital for their well-being. We need to make sure veterans know they're not alone, that their sacrifices are valued, and that they have a place in society.
It's about acknowledging the invisible wounds too, right? Making sure they have access to the mental health care they need.
Absolutely, and that's where we all come in. Family, friends, communities, we all have a role to play in supporting our veterans as they transition back to civilian life.
It's a collective responsibility.
It is, and I think this deep dive, it's really highlighting that. It's showing us how complex these issues are, how interconnected everything is, from the nature of warfare itself to the policies that are put in place to the support systems available back home. It's a whole ecosystem.
I completely agree. This conversation has been so insightful. And it's clear that we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore, so much more to learn.
You know, as we get to the end of this document, it really makes you think about the future of military psychiatry. Where do we go from here?
It does. It's been quite a journey. We've talked about everything from shell shock to PTSD to the unique challenges of modern warfare. So what do you think? What are the big questions that still need to be answered?
Well, the document points out some really important areas for future focus. For example, the development of even more effective therapies for PTSD and other combat-related mental health issues. We've made progress for sure.
Yeah, but there's always room for improvement, right?
Absolutely. The document specifically mentions virtual reality therapy, which has shown some really promising results in helping veterans process trauma.
That's amazing. Using technology to heal those invisible wounds. It's incredible to think about the possibilities.
It is. And that brings us to another area where more research is needed. Understanding the impact of modern warfare on mental health. Think about drone technology, cyber warfare, AI in combat. These are game changers, and we need to be ready for the unique psychological challenges they bring.
You mentioned drone warfare earlier. I'm still wrapping my head around the idea of pilots fighting a war from thousands of miles away. It seems like it would create a whole new set of stressors.
Definitely. Think about it. You're in a safe control room, but you're taking lives on a screen. It's a disconnect that raises all sorts of questions about moral injury, detachment, a long-term psychological impact.
It's like a whole new dimension of war, and it seems like we're only just beginning to understand the psychological ramifications.
We are. And it's not just drones. Cyber warfare brings its own unique challenges, too. The constant threat of cyber attacks, the potential for information overload, that blurring of lines between the physical and virtual worlds.
Like the battlefield is no longer a place, but a constant state of being.
Exactly. And we need to be prepared to address these challenges, investing in research, developing specialized training, creating support systems that recognize these unique stressors.
It's about adapting to a whole new landscape of warfare.
It is. And that leads us to another challenge we need to confront head on. The stigma surrounding mental health in the military. It's something we've talked about a lot, but it's worth repeating. We need to create a culture where seeking help is seen as a strength, not a weakness.
I agree. But it's a tough nut to crack, isn't it? How do we actually make that culture shift happen?
Well, it starts with open and honest conversations. Leaders need to set the tone, acknowledge that everyone struggles sometimes, and emphasize that seeking help is a sign of courage. It's about taking care of yourself and your team.
Normalizing mental health is part of overall well-being.
Exactly. And it's not just talking about it. We need to provide comprehensive mental health training to everyone in the military, from recruits to commanders.
What would that training look like?
It would equip them with the knowledge and skills to recognize the signs of mental health issues in themselves and in others. They'd learn how to provide basic support to someone who's struggling, how to navigate the system to get them professional help.
That sounds like a really valuable investment in the well-being of our forces.
It is, and it pays off in terms of morale, unit cohesion, and overall readiness.
The document also highlights the need for strong support networks for veterans as they transition back to civilian life, especially given all the complexities of reintegration we've discussed.
It's crucial. And it's more than just providing services. It's about creating a welcoming environment, a community where veterans feel valued, understood, connected.
Bridging that gap between military service and civilian life.
Right. And it takes everyone working together.
Right.
The military, government agencies, community organizations, individuals. We all have a role to play in supporting veterans.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We've learned so much about the history of military psychiatry, the challenges, the progress that's been made, and the work that still needs to be done. As we wrap up, is there a final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that caring for the mental health of those who serve is an ongoing mission. It requires attention, compassion, and commitment. We can't let those who have sacrificed so much struggle alone.
That's a powerful message. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener, both sobering and hopeful. It's a reminder that the wounds of war aren't always visible, and we all have a responsibility to support those who have served our country. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this deep dive into the world of military psychiatry. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic, so stay tuned.